Now, on BBC1, Sir Robin Day with Question Time.
Hello, good evening and welcome to another Question Time for 60 minutes of topical argument on questions raised by our audience here. Next week, by the way, the party political conference circus moves to Brighton and then on to Blackpool. In the meantime, for tonight, we have the somewhat unusual pleasure of having a panel, none of whom belongs to any political establishment. Around the table with me, Sir John Harvey-Jones, who until this year was chairman of ICI. His unconventional career has been in two very different stages. First, the Royal Navy for 20 years, in submarines and then in top-secret intelligence. Then he went into industry, starting at the bottom, and within 17 years he rose to become head of ICI, Britain's biggest manufacturing group. During his career, Sir John, who's now Chancellor of Bradford University, has earned epithets such as wild, buccaneering, and rambunctious. Linda Bellos is the left-wing leader of Lambeth Council. Her career in local government politics has been meteoric. She joined the Labour Party only in 1984 and was elected councillor in 1985, then rapidly succeeded to the Lambeth Labour leadership after Ted Knight was disqualified. But she's been criticised by Ted Knight today for bringing in a lawful balanced budget, which will mean cuts. After graduating from Sussex University, she became a militant campaigner for radical feminist and anti-racist movements. She has called the Labour Party, quote, a racist institution. Linda Bellos herself has been described as, and I quote again, a kind of caricature of that figure for which the Daily Mail has been searching, a black, lesbian, Jewish feminist. John Lloyd is editor of the Weekly New Statesman and has been for 18 months. Formerly, he was the award-winning industrial editor of the Financial Times. He's leaving the New Statesman shortly. Some of his colleagues have not always agreed with his editorial opinions, such as his pre-election advice that Neil Kinnock should rethink Labour's policy of unilateral nuclear disarmament. Mr. Lloyd admits that he's had disagreements with the New Statesman staff on many matters, but says he is leaving only to get back to writing. Charles Moore has been editor of The Spectator for 3 years, having been appointed when he was only 27. So he's younger than he looks. Before that, he was a leader writer on the Daily Telegraph. In the tradition of The Spectator, Mr. Moore is an independent, radical Tory, as in their different ways have most of his distinguished predecessors in his editorial chair, such as Ian MacLeod, Nigel Lawson, and Ian Gilmore. Mr. Moore also writes a weekly column in the Daily Express. There we are. Here we go. Mrs. Diane Storey is first. She is a Citizens Advice Bureau person. Mrs. Storey.
My question is, in the light of the recent mistakes in cervical smear tests, can the panel suggest any way of avoiding this happening again?
John Lloyd.
I know little about the specific instance, which I think was at Liverpool, where clearly, or it seems to me clearly, that there was a breakdown in the proper procedure. I make a modest political point here, and that is that it seems to me that preventive medicine, of which cervical smears is part, again as I understand it, is becoming more and more important. And it seems to me that that underpins the argument which the opposition parties make, Labour makes, for the National Health Service to be underpinned and to encourage people to take up or to take advantage of such things as cervical smear tests. Because I've seen in the press those women who have contracted cervical cancer have been overwhelmingly those who have not been tested. So it seems to me that at a time when the National Health Service is under some attack, the instance of Liverpool points to the National Health Service being supported and underpinned, and more preventive medicine of that kind being available to all.
Do you think All right, we'll come back to a later answer in due course. Charles Moore.
Well, I don't see John Lloyd's point at all there, because this is purely a question of an individual doctor. An individual doctor failed to notice the signs, and then, as I understand it, when some people there were worried by some of the signs and thought that the doctor hadn't noticed them, they then complained, and another doctor didn't notice them. I think it's purely a matter of individuals, and I can't think that you could order women to have a compulsory cervical smear, so I don't see that it raises any political question at all. This is a professional question.
But doesn't it show the system is faulty if it allows such errors by individuals to take place?
Well, that would be
on such a huge scale.
That would be professionally faulty, not faulty because of public policy.
Linda Bellos.
Well, I totally disagree. I mean, clearly there is a problem, but thousands of women were tested in Liverpool, and it was down to one doctor. That isn't a coincidence. We have a situation in which the National Health Service, for the last 8 years, has been starved of resources, and I find it shameful that so many people should be dependent upon the view of simply one doctor. However committed and hard-working an individual doctor, that they should have such a workload and that their judgment should not be backed up by other people's views, I think is frankly not only a shame, it's frankly scandalous that and our health should be dependent on individuals' views. And I believe that more resources must be provided to the National Health Service, who have been starved of resources, and the result of that has been the kind of situation we found in Liverpool.
John Harvey-Jones.
Well, I think the long-term solution of this is going to be that the thing will be done technically rather than by individual interpretation. And that is not that far away.
What do you mean, the slide will go into a computer?
Yes, and that actually will not be liable to individual bias. And so, trying to answer the question, I think there is hope and that the system will get better. I'm interested in the arguments which are adduced by my colleagues, but I'm not sure that having 2 doctors is necessarily going to make it any better, because look at Cleveland, which is an area which I'm involved in, and I think you're in real trouble here. You have to depend upon the interpretation of the professional. What worries me about the issue is that professionals tend to stand together. And there should be some way in which professionals can doubt other professionals' views without the sort of consequences which have occurred. It is only as a result of a massive amount of work that this particular problem, which is tragic for many women, has actually been brought to light.
Mrs. Story, or Miss Story, what do you think of what you've heard? Does it give you the answer to the question?
Well, I was hoping that, has been suggested, there should be more resources available to improve perhaps the technical side and so on. I'm very bothered, as I feel that as a mature person, you know, I need these tests regularly, and I hope that it will be an improvement on what there is at the moment.
Do you think more resources and a change of administrative policy would make a difference?
Well, as I understand it, this wasn't a problem of resources. It's that the tests were done in a perfectly proper way. The tests showed certain things, and a particular doctor didn't notice those things. Nobody's suggesting that the tests were skimped or inadequate. A doctor didn't notice, and a doctor has been named by an inquiry. Other staff did notice, did complain, did represent to another doctor. But what Sir John was talking about, the professional tendency of a profession to stand together, seems to have been the problem. I don't think it's a money problem.
Are there any I'll come back to you in a moment, Linda Bellos. Is there any more comments from the audience? Yes.
As a victim of having had cancer myself, I feel very strongly that every person needs a second opinion when going to their family doctor, and after having tests too, because it's not always found out on the first time that you visit the doctor that you actually have cancer.
How do you, I'm very interested in what you say, and everyone else is, but how do you deal with this problem? Is it natural that people will want to go and get a second opinion when they're told they're not in danger?
Yes, I think it probably probably is. You know, I think we should be far more cautious of the professionals. Doctors are not always right, and certainly we women should stay together and ask for a second opinion.
Yes, this other doctor who began to challenge it, he got a lot of hostility towards him, according to the report. The other doctor. Yes?
Yes, I think it's a pity that you come to the word challenge, that people can't work as a team, and that the other people involved couldn't talk together with the person who was supposedly the professional, and at that point in the discussion couldn't decide, well, perhaps there's a mistake here, without it being blown up and again coming to this word challenge, where people's integrity is questioned.
What do you say to that? This problem of, which Sir John Harvey-Jones introduced into our discussion, this problem of the professional medical people apparently having some sort of freemasonry not to object to each other's findings.
As I understand,
unlike judges and other people who would argue amongst each other all day long.
To name it too.
Linda Bellos.
Well, I tend to share that, but in fact I was going to just raise a point, which is both part of the Labour Party policy and something I'm very much in favour of, specifically in relation to cervical cancer as opposed to other forms of cancer. But I think there is a pressing need for well women clinics in which women can get far more sympathetic treatment, and it is preventative medicine practiced at well women clinics, for which there are very, very few in this country, and I would like to see far more, so that if you then go for a second opinion, go elsewhere, you're going to get, in the first case, far more sympathetic treatment.
Wait a moment, Sir John. There were some more questions. Yes, the lady there, please.
Liverpool isn't the only place where there are being problems with cervical smear tests. In my own area health authority, quite recently, women were waiting so long for the results of their tests that by the time they got the results, they found out they'd got cervical cancer, and it was too late for anything to be done about it. In areas where now more resources are being put in so that women can have the tests more frequently, still they're not often enough. It's no good saying every 3 years if you can develop cancer in a year and die of it. The resources are lack of resources rather are causing problems across the country with cervical smear
But
tests.
if everyone who is tested has to have a second opinion, or ought to have a second opinion from a second consultant or medical expert, and tested much more often, as you have suggested, that's going to need a great deal more in resources, isn't it?
Well, I'm sure if men suffered from cervical cancer, nobody would mind about putting the resources in it.
well, I think it's a reasonable point, and it's one in which the majority of this panel are, by your definition, more or less exempt from commenting on it, but I agree with you, if we would not. On Sir John's point, I think that the Cleveland case, as I understand it, showed that professionals very often don't stand together, and that in the Cleveland case, what you saw was a quite severe difference between professionals on what constituted child abuse. On the Liverpool case, and I think for many women, and the point I was seeking to make earlier, is it's not just getting a second opinion, which may, indeed, would be desirable, it's getting a first opinion, which many women simply don't get. And what I would argue for is a much more, the health of the nation depends upon people being more active in their own health. But that in turn depends upon a government, a National Health Service, making sure that people know where to go and know that when they do go, they will get support.
John Harvey-Jones, you were going to say something?
The point I wanted to make, and which distresses me about this discussion, is first of all, many cancers are now curable, and that's fact. And the problem depends on early detection. And I'd be very worried if this discussion created any distrust in trying to be tested. So that was the first point I wanted to make. I'm very doubtful about the second opinion because, and I'm not knocking the value of that, it may turn up the answer sometime. But you know, trying to prove a negative, trying to prove that everything's all right is extraordinarily difficult. Most people ask for a second opinion when there is a suspicion that something is wrong. And the problem is to alert at the first sign that there may be something wrong. Now, it is just possible that maybe we need to change the standards in this so that more people are referred on more stringent criteria than are applied at the moment. But win, lose or draw, if as a result of this program any woman failed to take a cervical cancer smear test, it would be an absolute tragedy.
Well, let us leave it there and move on to our many other questions which we have. And the next question is Peter Hardy, a solicitor.
Sir Robin, my question is, in view of the decision of the New South Wales Court of Appeal in the Spycatcher case, what further measures would the panel advocate to ensure that members of the Secret Service honour their obligations of secrecy and confidentiality?
Charles Moore.
Well, it's almost impossible because the traditions of these matters have broken down. In the end, the only real reason that people will honour their obligations is because they have a moral belief that they should honour their obligations. You can bribe them with money, you can threaten them with laws, but in the end, it's to do with what they believe is their duty. And if they have no sense of duty, or if their confidence has been lost in the system, then there's very little you can do about it. I mean, it seems in the case of Mr. Peter Wright that the big concern of his entire life is the size of his pension. And therefore, it might have been prudent of the British government to give him a rather bigger pension in the first place, and then we might have avoided all this trouble. But
well, to be fair to Mr. Peter Wright, he did also claim to be concerned about whether there'd been the head of MI5 had been a Russian agent, which he thought was a fairly important matter. He may have been wrong. I mean, rightly or wrongly, that was apparently his concern.
Well, Mr. Wright was involved in, by his own account, in the attempts to discredit a British Prime Minister and to use a right-wing campaign against the British Prime Minister, and he didn't seem to complain about that at the time, and he didn't complain for years afterwards, and it was only when it became clear to him that he was only going to get $3,000 a year or whatever that it was that the Treasury was going to vouchsafe him that he got very cross.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you again, but again, to be fair to Mr. Wright, I've read his book, which I got in.
Haven't you? That's a crime.
Which I got. Which
During a recent visit to Australia.
How did you buy it?
Well, I didn't buy it. I said I've got it, and I read it.
You stole it.
Because I thought if I was going to discuss it, I ought to have read it. But Mr. Wright did not take part in any plot. He actually declined to take part in the plot. He says a group of young chaps in MI5 wanted to do down Wilson and asked him to cooperate.
Exactly.
He said he wouldn't and went to Sir Michael Hanley.
This must be the point, isn't it? I'm amazed.
And he was against the plot. He doesn't tell us much about it.
Astounded that Charles, as a journalist, should be underpinning the right of silence in this matter, because the central point, apart from whether or not Hollis was an agent of the KGB, was that the central charge of Peter Wright's book is that a group of people tried to destabilize the 3 times elected Prime Minister of this country, Harold Wilson. Now, that has not yet been either proved or disproved, but that enormously serious charge, surely 1, has to come into the public arena, and 2, when it does come into the arena, must be tested. And that cavils about whether or not Peter Wright should have stuck to his contract with MI5 are essentially against the gravity of that charge, cavils, are they not?
Well, what further measures should be taken, and this is Mr. Hardy's question, to ensure that members of the Security Service honour their obligations? What further measures?
I find myself against the spirit of the question, as it were, because I think the spirit of the question is that they should shut up.
And they shouldn't do as they've said they're going to do, appeal to the federal court in Australia.
It seems to me that Wright had a story to tell which went beyond his obligation, and clearly there was a contractual obligation after he left MI5 not to talk about what he learned in MI5. Yet, his claim is, as I say, it is yet untested, is that there was this enormously important event which happened while he was in MI5, he knew about, he wanted to expose, if it is true, rightly wanted to expose, and that overrode his obligation to his previous employers.
Sir John Harvey-Jones, you were in the Cloak and Dagger man for some time, weren't you?
Yes, indeed, and I have many times been tested against the same sort of criteria that have been put to Peter Wright. I find your argument totally specious. If Mr. Wright was that concerned, and he should have been, he should have raised and blown the whistle at the time,
I agree.
not waited many years later to publish a book and make some money out of it. Now, I must say, in that funny world in which I spent some time, it is you only do that job if you have a belief in the cause for which you're working. And I don't think money will buy you out by your silence, because I have to tell you that in that world, there's money floating around like dogs have fleas. I mean, you know, you can sell anything to anybody, and it's a good and lucrative trade. The whole thing depends upon the honor, the belief, and the integrity of the people who are employed. And since you're in dirty work, it's very difficult to find people who have such belief in the cause that they are prepared.
Now, Mr. Hardy's question was, what further measures should the government take?
Be more careful about the guys you employ, is the answer.
But in this case, the government is going to appeal to the highest court in Australia. Are they right to do so?
In this case, I think the whole thing's a charade. It'll be a good Disney film in 5 years' time. I mean, I think it's a total waste of time.
Right, Linda Bellos.
Pass it around, Rob.
Well, everybody, for some time, we've been talking about the Official Secrets Act and the need to reform it. And I think, and in fact, I'm somewhat reminded of the pleasure the government has had about stressing open government on local authorities and how we ought to tell all. And they're quite right, we ought. But then the same goes for, I believe, for central government. Many of the things that are currently secrets ought not to be secrets. I think we must give a serious look at this Official Secrets Act, and having given thorough scrutiny at what we ought to be saying to all of us, after all, it's our money that's being spent, how our money's being spent, then I think it does behove civil servants, in whatever branch they're employed, to stick to their contracts of employment and not to disclose confidential information. What I'm saying is that I don't believe that we have the foundation. You say about who's employed, but who's employing and the terms on which they're being employed. People are being asked, whether it be Wright or anyone else, to keep secret that which we have a right to know. And I think that there are clearly things that ought to be properly official secrets, but what masquerades under official secrets currently is a sham and a nonsense, and frankly Britain is being...
Who should decide, if I may interrupt, who should decide what secrets ought to be kept and
I think that a common select...
I
think a common select committee is perfectly capable. I'm not saying that I should decide or that you should decide. I think a common select committee is perfectly capable of deciding that kind of information that ought to be made available to the public. And in fact, I read a little note to myself called the United States of America. There are, within that democracy, means by which the United States democracy is able to conduct its affairs partly in public and partly in private. That's a democracy, perfectly robust. I don't see why the kind of rules that prevail in relation to secrets should not prevail in this country. It's not undemocratic, so I believe.
Mr. Hardy, you as a solicitor asked this very interesting question. What further measures do you think, if any, the government should take in this or similar cases?
Well, I think, to start off with, I don't think the government had much choice but to take legal proceedings against Peter Wright. It is unfortunate, certainly from the government's point of view, that the proceedings have reached the stage they have reached.
Should they go on, having started them rightly, as you say?
I think on balance, probably yes. He has not honoured his contract. He's broken the law, and that although a lot of it to a great extent has leaked out already, although I hasten to say I have not read the book, I still think that...
As a solicitor, could you answer me this question without charging me a fee? Have they got any... One always has to put that caveat in when one says good morning to a solicitor. Are you suggesting they could, by further proceedings, manage to get any of the money which Mr. Wright is supposed to be coming in vast amounts from America or anyone else? Because I think that's what was hinted at by one of the judges in this latest Australian case this morning.
I couldn't give you an answer on that which would have any authority at all.
Well, that won't charge me a fee. Yes,
if I might put it to Mr. Hardy, even if you would advocate keeping Peter Wright silent, even if this central charge that he makes in the book, that there was a plot, a serious plot within MI5 to destabilize the Prime Minister of the day, even if that were proven to be true, and we don't know that, does the seriousness of that allegation not override the contractual obligation that Wright might or might not have?
Well, I accept there's a genuine problem, but I think, first of all, the difficulty does Peter Wright or anyone else have the right to decide what is sufficiently serious to disclose and what isn't?
That's pretty
Secondly,
serious,
the point's
isn't
been
it?
made, why didn't he disclose
That is pretty serious.
Yes, but his method of disclosure was simply to write the book many years after the event.
I think John is being innocent in assuming that Mr. Wright's allegations are particularly likely to be true. I mean, it's clear that he's a very bitter man. I recur to his pension, but there's also, and this is not a defence of Mr. Wright, but an explanation of his behaviour, that he worked most of his working life in an organisation which he gradually discovered was run by public schoolboys, and he wasn't a public schoolboy, who were, for the most part, traitors. And so it wasn't...
Oh, not for the most part.
So I wasn't a public schoolboy, and I wasn't a traitor.
Let me defend public schoolboys.
And the minority.
You weren't the big cheese, I think, at the crucial moment. I mean, the point is that Anthony Blunt, Guy Burgess, Kim Philby, and so on betrayed important secrets and held important positions. And it's difficult if you're working in an organisation like that where you suspect all these things to be going on and accusations even against the head of it, Sir Roger Hollis. It's difficult to maintain your sense of duty and your sense of trust. I don't defend anything that Mr. Wright has done, but I don't think it's all that surprising in view of the fact that all these characters, when they weren't in bed with one another, were telling the Russians what was going on.
Right. The gentleman there, yes? Yes?
Does this, when we talk about actual keeping things secret, right? We actually talk about keeping things secret. Was it wrong to hush up Watergate? Now, surely this is an English version of Watergate, where there's been corruption within MI5, there's been destabilisation of a government, and the government, Mrs. Thatcher, has actually tried to hide this information. Now, is that right? Should the public have information kept from them?
Well, that has been raised by Linda already, and yes, the gentleman there.
We came here tonight to discuss current affairs.
Yes.
Cervical smears tests are years old. Peter Wright's book is months old. 2 days ago, a British tango with a British flag was blown up.
Would you shut up? Let me run the programme. A lot of people wanted to ask the questions we've heard about, and half the population of the country are personally interested in the cervical smears. The Smythe bycatcher case only occurred today, and it is of the utmost political interest. And other matters, which you have tried to raise quite reasonably, until I told her to shut up, may well come in the programme. So have a bit of patience, chum. Yes. Good. Well, these are both current affairs, which we have been discussing with our usual skill and vigour. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir Robin, I also put the same question as Peter Hardy put it, exactly the same, but I'll phrase other ways. Now, what's the national security in this when there is a spy catcher already awaiting on the library shelf in Oxfordshire County Library, and I know for a fact. So what's so special about it? Because some people have already read in England.
Well, I think do you agree with that? Do you see it? What is the answer to that, Sir John?
Well, I think this is why I take the view that the thing is now a Disney farce.
Do you think there's any...
sadly, against the original questioner. I share the view that it would be nice to see if Mr. Wright did not profit by the betrayal of his trust. I would have, as I said earlier, have more respect for him if he'd raised the issue at the time when it was vital and when something could be done about it. But now, pursuing the thing on and on, when the book is there, it's merely selling more books.
Does anyone have anything to add to that? Because we seem to be repeating ourselves. Yes.
Sir John did say that it was up to Peter Wright to blow the whistle at the time that he was confronted with this situation. But Sarah Tisdall tried to alert us, and she received an imprisonment. There has to be somebody in authority that such people can turn to in confidence. And well, obviously there wasn't anyone.
Without going into that completely different case, do you see any
Yes,
Any parallel?
There is a parallel in this, in the sense that there is obviously information which is privileged and which civil servants and members of the Secret Service are sworn not to divulge. And at times, with Sarah Tisdall and Clive Ponting, and we are told with Peter Wright, that information, or what they have witnessed in the course of their professional lives, which they are sworn to keep secret, they feel a moral obligation, a larger obligation than the contractual one, to reveal to the world. Now, I agree with Sir John. He should have blown the whistle earlier. If it was what he says it is, it should have been in the open when he learned of it, immediately, although he does say he reported it to his superiors. But he should have blown the whistle then.
Okay.
But it seems to me right to blow the whistle even in matters like that, even if, by doing so, you are breaking your contract.
Well, may I blow the whistle on this discussion now and move to an even more important matter, which I think comes into the heading of current affairs. Roy Houghton, who is a television dealer.
Sir Robin.
Yes.
With so much tension in the Gulf area, now involving many different countries, what would the panel try to achieve to desensitise the situation?
Sir John.
Well, I think it would be very desirable that the UN took over the management of the Gulf. I have to say that with some cynicism, because I fought in the Korean War as a member of a UN force. But nevertheless, I think the United Nations really should take over the protection of shipping in the Gulf.
With whose navy?
With the members of the United Nations. I mean, when I was serving the United
What, American ships? And
American ships, Russian ships.
Russian ships, right.
The lot.
Okay, sorry.
That's the whole purpose of making it a UN force. And I have a great belief that that would be a helpful thing to do. I have to say, I have a despairing feeling of no hope about the Gulf situation. Every time, and I know Iranians, and I used to do business in Iran, but every time I see all those guys with beards and jumping up and down, I have a sinking feeling that there's no way this thing is going to sort itself out. And I don't know what more reason is going to create that. But some attempt to maintain the Gulf as an open water, I think, would be helpful.
Linda Bellos.
I share that view about the United Nations, but I do think that if the United States were to withdraw, it would be helpful. I don't believe that the reflagging was anything other than a provocative act from which Britain and others then had to follow suit. I don't think it's helped in any way, and I think it would certainly assist the situation if the United States were now to withdraw. I'd say the same, of course, of the USSR.
Charles Moore?
Well, I think the difficulty is who is the enemy in this? Because we have a very low opinion of Iran, I think quite rightly, and the way it behaves.
I think you can speak for yourself.
Well, I think most people in this room would not think that Iran is and I'm surprised that Linda Bellos, the great feminist, thinks that the rule of the veil in Iran is a splendid thing. But the international behavior of Iran has been detestable. But I think it doesn't follow from that it's obvious that in this case, Iran is the enemy any more than Iraq. It seems to me one of those situations in which you're dealing with two powers who virulently hate one another, and it's by no means obvious where the Western interest lies, except that in neither case should one totally destroy the other. So if you looked at it in cynical terms, you could say there might be something to be said for a continuing war in which the two neutralize the other. If you looked at it in more moral terms, you would hope that a peace could be arrived at. But I think it's dangerous for us to say that we must work out a way of destroying Iran in this. What needs to be done is to try and achieve peace. And Iraq has now offered to accept the UN ceasefire, and Iran has refused, and therefore the pressure's on Iran. But I don't think we should run away with thinking that Iran is the only enemy in all this.
But what would you do to desensitize the situation, Mr. Houghton asked?
Well,
what do you think should be done?
I don't know is the short answer. I mean,
Right.
and it's clear to me that the great powers, and all the powers don't know. Mr. Perez de Cuellar goes there and does his best.
Well, the Russians have proposed Sir John Harvey-Jones' solution.
Are you complimenting him? Or?
No, I'm just stating. I'm pointing out a fact.
Well, let's hurry, Robin. But, you know, I mean, I have to say, I think an arms embargo, all history shows that's a total waste of time. Just puts the price up, makes a lot of guys even richer. It's not going to stop the war for yonks.
Okay. John Lloyd, you have your turn.
It's true, obviously, that an arms embargo will not stop the arms going in. It will raise the price. It may therefore mean that less arms will go in. It may favor one side against the other. It seems to me that I think there's something of a round-table consensus on this, that the force which tries to separate the two sides should be a UN force rather than one which is seen to be partial, which is American or British or Western only. That it also seems to me that from what Mr. Shevardnadze has said, the Russian interest in this is legitimate and should be brought in. But I haven't Sir John's experience of fighting with a UN force. As a journalist, I had the experience of seeing a UN force operate in Cyprus after the Turks invaded there in 1972, and UN forces, Canadians, Irish and others, were caught in the middle of that conflict and took heavy casualties. So that I think one should not suppose that a UN force coming in is, as it were, a blanket of foam stopping, and it has not been in the Middle East, it would not be in the Gulf. When you have an aggressive fundamentalist nationalism, which you see in Iran, that kind of energy, and the kind of energy which allows or encourages young men and young women, for that matter, to joyfully, as it seems, lay down their lives for their country, is not the kind of energy which can be stopped by a few resolutions or even a few warships. So it isn't going to be easy or easy of accomplishment, but it should at least be tried. And I do think that a partial force, or a force seen to be partial, like the United States is, should be replaced by one which is seen to be less partial.
But Iran, of course, thinks the UN is not impartial.
Indeed it does. And Iran's view is that any force which stands against its claims and its ideology is partial by definition.
Mr. Hutton, you asked the question. What do you think should be done, if you know?
I don't know in 2 words, but
of the answers you've heard, which strikes you as most statesmanlike?
Perhaps we should send Sir John with his UN mission.
Right? Yes, sir.
Well, I don't know whether many people in the audience saw the programme Breakfast Television a few weeks ago, but I thought it was particularly poignant and interesting that they should have interviewed a captain of one of the vessels that sails in the Gulf, and he picked
a merchantman or a naval vessel?
A merchant vessel.
Yes.
And he picked exactly on St. John's answer when he was asked, what can we do? And don't forget that he was a man who had to sail his ship and his crew in the Gulf. He said arms embargo, and I go along totally with Sir John. I think arms embargo is the strongest way in which we can, apart from economic pressures...
Well, he said the very opposite. He said the arms embargo was a load of...
No, I misunderstood him. I mean, they must not get hold of arms. They must be prevented from getting... Sorry, Sir John, I misunderstood, but they must be prevented from getting hold of the arms with which they are able to fight.
Well, that's all very well.
Yes, yes.
That's all very well, and we can have as many political decisions in many parliaments, in the United Nations. The trouble is that the people who run the arms trade make money out of it, and it is about international capitalism. They have too much money to make out of it, and it doesn't matter what moral position we take, what pleadings we make. We talk about morality, we talk about the children who are being killed.